Hello, and welcome to this ELCA Fund for Leaders online event we are calling For Such a Time as This, a Leadership Summit. My name is Pastor Mark Olson, and it is my great joy to serve as the director of the ELCA Fund for Leaders, and I will be serving as the host for this online event today. My thanks to each of you for making time to participate in this gathering, whether you're watching live now on January 21st or are watching the recording of this event that will be made available after the fact. Either way, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you also for your interest in learning more about the ELCA Fund for Leaders and about some of the recent seminary graduates it has been our privilege to support. Thank you also for your commitment to help support the raising up and equipping of future pastors and deacons for our church. Our ministry would not be possible without you. This academic year, the Fund for Leaders is supporting 297 ELCA seminary students with just over $2.8 million in scholarship support as they study at our 7 ELCA seminaries, preparing to become rostered ministers for our church. Now, before we get started, one of the questions that was submitted to us ahead of time by someone who registered for this event was this: how many people are studying to be rostered ministers as of February 1st, 2021? It's an excellent question. One way that I can answer that is to say that as of yesterday, which is when we ran the report, January 20th, there were 1,851 active candidates for ministry at some stage of the ELCA candidacy process. But keep in mind, not all of those candidates are full-time ELCA seminary students. Some of those candidates are being received from other traditions. Some of those candidates are pursuing ordination through theological education for emerging ministries, or the TEAM program, as it's called. Some are candidates that are studying at non-ELCA seminaries and divinity schools. Some are even candidates who just got into the entrance stage of candidacy and haven't even begun their studies yet. Another way to answer the question would be to say that in 2019, our 7 ELCA seminaries had just over 900 ELCA students enrolled who were studying to become rostered ministers for our church. And that number is about 2/3 of the number who were similarly enrolled just 10 years earlier. Finally, I can also say that over the last few years, synods have only been able to fill about 25% of their first call pastoral vacancies through the church-wide assignment process. So in sum, the need for new pastors and deacons remains strong, and it is perhaps greater now than it has ever been before. The name of today's event, For Such a Time as This, as many of you know, is drawn from the Hebrew scriptures, from the book of Esther. It's a phrase that is used to speak of a Jewish woman named Esther who finds herself in a unique position of leadership as the Queen of Persia, from which she is able to save her fellow Jews from destruction. It is a story of call and of courage. And it seems that maybe that phrase, for such a time as this, speaks as well about and for church leaders today who have been called to lead congregations in the remarkable times in which we have recently been living throughout 2020 and through today. We think that's true for the pastors that we have gathered together today for this panel discussion. Each of them was supported in their seminary education by full tuition scholarships from the ELCA Fund for Leaders. And we hope that their answers that they share in response to the questions that you have already submitted to us will give you some insight into the kinds of excellent leaders the Fund for Leaders is able to support and the kind of excellent ministry that they and others like them are leading in our church. Everyone who registered for this event has already received biographic sketches for our four guest pastors, so I will make their introductions right now brief. The Reverend Daniel Locke is a graduate of Lutheran Theological Southern Seminary and was ordained in 2017. He serves as pastor of St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Jacksonville, Florida. The Reverend Benjamin Hogue is a graduate of Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary and was ordained in 2018. He serves as associate pastor of Lutheran Church of the Reformation in Washington, D.C. The Reverend Alyssa Burnt McMullen is a graduate of Luther Seminary and was ordained in 2019. She serves as pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Arlington, South Dakota. And the Reverend Raylan Robinson is a graduate of United Lutheran Seminary and was ordained in 2020 on Reformation Day, if I'm remembering correctly, Raylan. And Raylan serves as associate pastor of Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita, Kansas. My thanks to each of you, each of these pastors, for being willing conversation partners with us today. And as we get set to begin, let us pray. Loving God, in holy baptism, you have called and gathered us together across all human divisions and reconciled us to yourself in one body through the cross. Strengthen us now by your presence, that our discussion and reflections today may be rooted and grounded in your love for us and for the building up of your church. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior and Lord. Amen. So let's get started. Yesterday, all of us watched as a new president and vice president were inaugurated in what turned out to be, thankfully, a peaceful political transition. But we know that this recent election cycle was anything but smooth, and that the storming of the US Capitol by a riotous mob on January 6th may, in many ways, have been a symptom of the deep divisions that exist in our country. So with that in mind, panelists, here's my opening question for you. What have you learned about doing ministry in hyper-partisan times with congregation members who may be sharply divided? And of course, we all realize that each of the contexts in which you are serving is a little bit different, ranging perhaps from Ben, whose congregation is literally on Capitol Hill across the street from the US Capitol, perhaps to Alyssa in a small town in South Dakota. So which one of you would like to take that first question? Just put your hand up and unmute yourself. Please, Alyssa.
Yeah, I can share. So I am in South Dakota, a small town, a town of about 900 people. And what I've learned about doing ministry in a time that is sharply divided, and my congregation is sharply divided, everything, and my family is, everything in life is, right?
Sure.
What I've learned is that my call is the same, right? Which is to preach the gospel, and that anytime I don't know what to say, that's absolutely where I have to lean. That's the only place that I can lean. And so sometimes that means a word that feels too bold for me, and a word that feels too bold for my people, that I know makes me like shake a little bit because it makes me nervous. Whether that's about politics, whether that's about climate change, that's like a crazy thing to people, climate change, whether it's about racial equality or income equality or economic, any of that, right? Scripture gives us what we need to speak into that, which is always both a word of God's justice and a word of God's forgiveness. Because sometimes what people need to hear is that the way they thought before, the way they think now, is allowed to change, that God forgives us for such things, not without calling us to action, not without a call to justice, but the gospel has it, and that's where I lean and get my footing in that. Also, preaching to a camera makes that a lot easier, so I'll throw that in. To be bold, not as hard when you don't have people sitting right in front of you. Just as important, but just different.
Sure. Thanks for that answer, Alyssa. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, and you mentioned Reformation is here on Capitol Hill. Certainly, the events of the 6th had a toll on our community. At Reformation here, we say we proclaim the gospel to the nation and the neighborhood. And so talking about these hyper partisan times, tension in the air, the 6th really reminded me that while my call is to the nation and the neighborhood, in moments like that, I needed to turn to the neighborhood. I needed to turn to my people who call this place home, who call Capitol Hill home, rather than just the Capitol building. I have members who were in the previous administration, who are in the current administration, who are representatives, but also who work for who are staffers, who work for representatives. And I just need to respond to their needs as their pastor. And that was the gift, I think, for me these last few weeks. And certainly is that I get to show up in really intimate places in people's lives and be their pastor, accompany them. And so while many people were able to respond to the nation on the 6th and beyond and really respond, I took a lot of deep pride in that my job in those moments was to hold my neighborhood and those people in their grief, in their sadness, in their shock and awe. So it certainly it can't allow no one's beliefs politically can seep into the care that I give, and I'm glad that they're allowing me to show up in some of those spaces.
Thank you, Ben. Daniel?
Yeah, to kind of jump from Melissa and affirm Ben that we too here in Jacksonville are praying for your neighborhood regularly. And thanks for the ministry you do there. The question had me kind of focus in on sermons because that seems to be the primary point at which we have contact with the majority of our congregations. And so two things I've kind of learned. One is affirmed what I thought to always be true, and realizing it's true is that for better or worse, folks will always hear what it is they want to hear oftentimes. And I've also learned that there are many things in partisan times and that are become triggers for folks. And those words are used in other outlets in our world, like media outlets and cultural outlets that carry weight for people in different ways. And so to just use those taglines, or if I say Black Lives Matter, or if I say white supremacy, they have different definitions for folks. And so I've learned that to just come out and boldly say things, as nervous as they make me, is not always the most helpful approach. But rather, I've learned that if I build a good enough foundation of relationship with everyone in the congregation, then hopefully there's this trust that each and every time I can lead them closer to a line, and let the Spirit help them see a new perspective, perhaps not to cross the line, but to engage in a new direction. And so really leaned into that. And the last part of that is I've learned that I've got to stay true to who I am. And so if I just pick one event that happens and all of a sudden I become, a little more bold in proclamation, or I use phrases I don't usually use, or I pull out the kind of trigger things, that's going to do more damage, I think, in the long run than the immediate moment. So I just try to stay true to my character and true to my style, and just trust the Spirit to lead in uncomfortable ways sometimes.
Thanks, Daniel. It's always a helpful reminder for each of us always to be our authentic selves, right? Raylan, did you want to add to that conversation? Then I'm going to build on that with a new question that is sort of related, and again, hopefully you'll each respond authentically as you're able. So, in a country as divided as ours is today, in what ways have you striven to promote acceptance of diverse ideas and unity within your congregation? So that's sort of another angle to come at the underlying question. And I appreciated also Daniel talking about proclamation and how we approach proclamation. The preaching of a sermon is one context, but then there are certainly other contexts in which, as pastors, you're interacting with the people in your care, the people who have called you, whom you serve. That sometimes can afford other levels of conversation and depth of exchange. So let me see if anybody would like to respond to that in terms of ways that you've striven to promote acceptance of diverse ideas and unity within your congregation. Sure, Ben?
Yeah, I think some of that authenticity, just being who we are. A saint mentor of mine says the greatest grace we have is the grace to be ourselves. And so
Mhm.
I'm able to show up as my authentic self, which, me being me, a partnered gay man, engaged, did make a few people uncomfortable in my congregation. And I trust that the Spirit is working in my life and in theirs and in between us to be able to have different ideas, but I still get to show up on a Sunday and break bread with those folks and to preach the gospel, to walk into hospital rooms and to baptize children. These are just these wonderful moments that they have allowed me. There's trust that I was able to build. And I think that's a lot of trust in the Spirit that acceptance will happen. And then it's also leveraging what power and privilege I do have as a cisgendered male white person, to say, okay, now how can I leverage some of this power so that my ideas or my things that might be different for another colleague of mine, congregation over, how can I then step to the forefront when they aren't able, and how have they done that for me? So there are there's a beauty of these diverse ideas, and then also there's being true to your authentic self and leading with that, knowing that there is enough grace for us to be our indeed authentic selves.
Terrific. Thank you. And thanks also for talking about other partners in other congregations, other faith communities with which your congregation and each of your congregations, I'm sure, is engaged and has a relationship. Anybody else want to offer a response to that question again, in terms of looking for ways to promote acceptance of diverse ideas and unity within congregations? Yes, Raylan.
Yeah, so I will say also like just introducing rather like different theologies into my sermons and highlighting different thought processes as
Mhm.
well as different literature. So while my context is very homogenous and it's very the same, I like not to ruffle them, but to give them to be engaged with other texts has definitely been one of the instruments that I use. So that is introducing different theological thought and different theologians and what they have to say to accompany the scripture, the ancient text, as
Mhm.
well as allowing different literature to be introduced into our book club. So not the same, but like spicing it up a little bit and adding a female voice or a person of
Right.
color or like a plethora of different ones that we would never naturally hear, just
Mhm.
just where the context of which I serve as well as where. So yeah, and having that partnership is definitely key. Rather it is the parish across the road or across the town.
Thanks for that, Raylan, and thanks for that reminder, I think, to all of us that none of us is in ministry alone, right? Not only do we have these others who are around us and perhaps even other ministry partners and other lay leaders in our congregations, but then we have the voices and the teachings and the lessons of others that have gone before us that we can weave and incorporate into our ministries. Daniel, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, just so one up front for these kind of conversations is always naming my own limitations of experience,
Mhm.
and that I have one very narrow experience of life, and so therefore I too have that confession piece that I don't know as much as I should, and I've messed up along the way, but I continue to learn more as a white male.
Yep.
Especially my perspective is limited, and so naming that too helps others name that as well. And then second, kind of more behind the scenes is not really upfront and present for folks is where I turn to for sermon aid as I'm doing exegesis and looking at other voices and what they say about the text, and try to be mindful of who it is that I'm drawing upon, and who the authors are of those kind of those companion pieces, to make sure those perspectives and voices are at least read, and hopefully heard.
Excellent. All very helpful answers and wonderful insights. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm going to move to a slightly different subject. As I said to one of our panelists earlier this week in a pre-Zoom session together, I think every generation of pastors that has ever been has always found itself having to confront one or more situations that present themselves to which they need to respond in their ministry, for which at some point they think, there was no class on this in seminary. You know, I think we've all been there in at one time or another. I know for me, 20 years ago, it was the terrorist attacks of 9/11. That happened for me 3 weeks after I started my first call at a congregation in Northern Virginia, about 4 miles from the Pentagon. And there was no class in seminary on how to lead a congregation in the midst of that kind of a national tragedy and terrorism kind of event. For all four of you, I suspect that the novel coronavirus pandemic has been such a situation. There's no class in seminary on how to lead a congregation during a pandemic, at least not to the best of my knowledge. So we all know that COVID-19 has affected almost every aspect of our lives, from work to school, to our lives of faith, to travel. Beginning this past March, almost a year ago, many of us found ourselves having to pivot to new ways of doing ministry, from how we gather for worship to how we provide pastoral care. So I'm going to throw out another jump ball for you again, another question, which is, what has gone well for you and what challenges have you had as you have made such pivots in the last year? Let's.
We all had a second, I guess.
That was a wonderful, and all four of you raised your hands at the same time. So let me start with Raylan, and then I'll go to Alyssa, and then to Ben.
I guess some of the struggles I personally have faced is I've lost a lot of my parishioners in this time. So being by their side in that transition has been hard. And then not feeling like enough, right? I don't know about you guys, but I've felt a lot of times like I'm not enough because I'm not doing my job, which is like going to the bedside of hospitals. It's going to visit them in their homes. It's breaking bread and fellowship. And that has been a very challenging moment. So like the moments where I'm like on speakerphone while a nurse holds me up so I can like do scripture or prayer as they transition, while I'm not physically there, is that presence of my voice and knowing that that too is ministry. So I've had to look at what ministry looks at differently than what we're really accustomed to. And that is a lot of the time stepping outside of the box, doing a lot of things and failing has been a big part of my time with COVID and ministering to my contacts, my parishioners, is like, I don't know if this is going to work. Like, is Zoom coffee hour going to work? And sometimes it does. And then sometimes it does not, because Zoom fatigue is real. Or I don't know how we're going to, or just also standing in the fact of like the COVID numbers are high, and choosing to like follow the CDC rules and continuously closing the buildings. Is that a good way? So loving, you have to love a little harder. And I'm finding that to be a part of COVID, is loving your parishioners a little harder when they want to open up and you want to remain closed, and just meeting people where they are.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Raylan. Alyssa?
Yeah, I would absolutely echo. I fell into the trap right away of feeling like I wasn't doing enough. And then so I did too much. So, feeling like I had to respond to every area of life that this was touching, whether that was information or conversation I was having with people over the phone about where they were struggling, or feeling like there was this hole where church life used to be. So how do we fill this hole, and what do people need in that? And in that, I ignored what I needed. And that's always a problem, right? That is something we learn in seminary. We should not be ignoring the things that we need. So um, I learned how to give myself space and how to let ministry and let the church be the church. So rely on others to do things, ask others to do things. Know that if I don't have a daily prayer every day for 60 days, like it'll be fine. It's going to be fine. People are still praying. I can still call people, like giving that grace. And I tried to communicate that in a way to let other people know they're afforded the same thing. They're afforded to take time and space when life is hard, when we don't know what to do, to step back and to maybe be frustrated with what's going on in the world, whether that's pandemic related or all of the ways the pandemic puts its tentacles into things, right? Like,
Mhm.
even if we're upset, to step back and just be for a second. Not, it doesn't need our immediate response. Sometimes things do, but a lot of times things don't. And there was a lot of peace in that. And I did hear from people like, thank you for that word. Thank you for telling me it was okay to slow down. Um, and I think about that every day. I still have to remind myself of that, especially now as things like go back to normal. And there's again that renewed sense of how do we do it all again? Or how do we do what we were doing before? And it just isn't. We have to be willing to fail. Raylan was right.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I appreciate especially not the reminder that these times call for us to be extending grace upon grace to one another, but then also that the reminder that we need to sometimes extend that same grace to ourselves. And I know for rostered ministers, sometimes that's the harder of the two. Ben, you had your hand up, I think.
Yeah, I think if I heard correctly, there were challenges and things that have gone well or
Sure, yes.
celebrations. And I think I resonate so deeply with the wanting to sort of overcompensate for the lack of not seeing people and some of that. And the fact that we're still doing ministry, I think, is a reason to celebrate and is something that has continued to go well. We have figured out how to do church in new and dynamic ways that I think will carry us into the future, see new people. We did a really successful stewardship campaign, and the commitments or the pledges we received from people who weren't members and out of state. Like, there are some exciting things that can happen with this because of what God is doing at the same time as what the world is doing. And so God is up to something. I am really excited for that. And it's been challenged, certainly. There's no denying the fact that there has been a lot of grief, and holding that grief has been a lot. Trying to experience the grief while holding others is difficult. And then there are those wins, albeit sometimes small. We still celebrate them when we can.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for that. Daniel, did you put your hand up? I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I call on you if you did.
Oh, we all did. I echo
Yeah,
everything here. For me, I
yeah.
was thinking about the pastoral, I call it my pastoral equity, or the number of spoons I have to engage in things. That I was doing a full-time ministry job, and then COVID hit, and then there was all these additional things that I took on, right? And so that pushes something else off the plate somewhere. And so you get this extra kind of stress level. And I agree that one thing that went really well, I think, for us is we were able to pivot from day one very effectively and efficiently. So we kind of retain that worshiping community on a Sunday morning, and folks are able to worship online, not watch worship, but they're able to worship online, and they join kind of that way. And so just briefly, I know, because I've heard from folks, that we have people who visit our church either by invitation or they just Google us, that would not have otherwise stepped a foot in a church building because of their past traumatic experience in one way or another. But this is a safe way for them to engage in worship and test the waters again, if you will, that maybe someday they might step back into. But I think in the long run, this is going to be a really good thing for us as a church as a whole. Kind of the pivot we've had to make digitally, but I'll stop there for
Yeah,
time's
no,
sake.
that's great. And I have a follow-up question that's prompted by your answers. And so I'm wondering, which of your congregations, which of you and your congregations who have established an online presence that perhaps you didn't have before, whether it's worship options or online Bible studies and different kinds of gatherings, Zoom coffee hour. How many of you are already planning on continuing those, even when we get into what we would at this point call a post-COVID, right? Once everybody's vaccinated and herd immunity, whatever it may be that allows us to resume some sort of pre-January 2020 normalcy, to use air quotes that you can see on the video. But how many of you are planning on to continue that online presence as you move into the future? Yeah, so all four, that I think, Ben, your comment resonated with me in a big way. I think congregations that view themselves from here forward as being two campus congregations. As a clergy friend of mine who serves a congregation in the Metro DC Synod, Travis Kern and I were talking about recently, thinking of, we have two campuses. We have this physical campus and we have a digital campus. And I think that's sort of going to be the future of ministry for many of us and much of the church. I'm going to pivot now in a different direction. Thank you for those comments. Another pandemic that drew national attention in 2020 was that of racism. The killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, to name just a few, sparked a renewed movement for racial and social justice across our country and indeed around the world. So with that in mind, what have been some of your experiences leading in parish ministry in the face of these kinds of this movement and these calls for racial justice and equality? What does that look like for you? Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, I think something that a lot of folks did, especially this summer, is they wanted to read the book and they wanted to kind of dive in and do the book study, even talk to folks about it and have that. And was that where it was going to end? And that's what I sort of have noticed and want and felt the call to lead is, let's lead past the last chapter of that book. Let's lead past we're just learning. It is good to learn and to listen, and we need to do that, especially if congregations haven't been in that position before. But if this has propelled us to learn and to listen, then how can we lead? How can we, again, leverage our power as a predominantly white, either denomination or some of us congregations in the contexts in which we are? And that's something Reformation has decided to do in a lot of ways. Though we've been active in racial justice movements, we really wanted to say, what is the city doing? What are our interfaith partners doing? How can we engage in this way here with our literal neighbors, with those that have been denied and shut down and excluded from our congregation in many ways? And so I think that's what's been important too. It's, yes, this summer has allowed a lot of folks to read the books, but I don't want it to just end there. And it's nice to be able to lead in a congregation that will allow us to take the next steps while continuing to listen and to learn. We can do hard things and we can do many hard things at the same time. And I think that's something we've experienced right now. COVID has also allowed the virtualness of this to be a little bit more convenient, to do some of those studies, to do some of those things virtually rather than having to commit time, traffic and all of that. To be able to do this from the comfort of your home has been a nice perk as well.
Sure. And thanks also for sharing that experience of particularly helping to lead your congregation to look outward, not just inward, but to engage community and to engage others in your community for fruitful dialogue. Other hands, I think, had gone up. Yes, Raylan.
Take this one. So yeah, so I serve predominantly white space like churches. So a lot of the times it is that book that we want to read and then be done with it, and it goes on our bookshelf, right? So a lot of what my space or what I've challenged my parishioners to do is to see who's in the room and who's not in the room. see and just like who's in the room, who's not in the room, what verbiage people use a lot of the times, while in a lot of the cases, I'm the only person of color in any of those spaces. So then what's that reaction? It's reactionary, right? So then how does my presence influence the way you see things, or vice versa in like your family unit? So it's a lot of bringing it out. I think that what the place that I am currently, we have anti-racism training, and while anti-racism training is just kind of a band-aid, it's actually like giving people, passing the baton to actually work through this and to work through these challenges in a loving way, and at the end of the day, always meeting people where they are. So I've introduced like This Far by Faith, which is a hymnal that a lot of people don't know about, which is, it's Augsburg, but it has the hymnal, and just having some of that liturgy placed within my worship service. So then it elevates it, right? So then you can introduce it not in an unauthentic way, but giving people more of that, what they need. So more of like the meat and potatoes. And in book choices, we're currently reading Reggie Williams' Bonhoeffer's Black Jesus. That was not a plug by any means, but just seeing like different literature and different authors, because while it's all great and dandy to have a person of color in leadership, what does that look like when that person is no longer there? How are you leading, and how are you walking in Jesus's footsteps, you know? So that's also a call of action.
Excellent. Thank you. Daniel or Alyssa, had you put your hands up? I just want to make sure. Yes, Alyssa, I'm sorry. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll share a little bit. I think because it's important, it's important for everybody, but important for me to think about this contextually. My congregation is 100% white. My town is almost 100% white. And a lot of the reaction was that there was no reaction. And that was very confusing for me, especially coming from being part of other communities in college and in graduate school where that was not the case, right? And it was sort of like radio silence here. So I started to find ways just to have a conversation. And we didn't do a book study. We didn't have anything like that. And that would have been lovely and wonderful. And I certainly thought about it, but I didn't even know if my people could even engage in that, like would not have been willing or ready, right? And so I approached it very much with lots of small group ministry, particularly with kids, and just making them aware that we can talk about this at church. And actually, I think you should talk about everything at church. Like there should not be something you can't talk about here, right? And not only we can talk about it, but you can have a thought about it. And you should share that thought. And we should talk about what Jesus might say to that thought and look at scripture, to try to pull into this conversation that it matters. And not only that it matters, but that it matters here. And so I've tried to do that, especially with confirmation kids, but also with my counsel. Kids are much better at it than adults. And we have a women's Bible study as well, just to try to invite conversation and allow people to feel like they have a place to speak. And usually, luckily for us, speak respectfully and be willing to hear different perspectives.
Thanks. Daniel, did your hand go up or no? And that's okay if it didn't.
No, I didn't.
Okay. Okay. One of the beautiful things that I think all three of you who answered said, and I'm sure this is part of Daniel's perspective. I don't want to speak for him, but for us as church leaders to have the community of faith, as Alyssa was just saying, to be a safe place where people can talk and engage in conversation about difficult topics. Reflecting on that original topic of conversation today, the polarization, the divided the country in which we live, where for so many people it is hard to find safe places to engage in conversations out of fear of how people will react. For us as church to be able to be a place where we can get people to engage and have hard conversations about hard topics, where we're reflecting and oftentimes leading to confession and then seeking forgiveness and reconciliation, I think is just, for each of you to do that as you described it in your context is wonderful. I want to move on in the interest of time, because we could spend an hour talking about any one of these topics. to talk about something just a little bit different. As church, we want our rostered ministers, we want the four of you and others like you to be whole and well equipped and able to serve in ministry for the long haul, whatever that looks like. And the Fund for Leaders has a part to play in fostering such wellness, particularly financial wellness. That's a big part of what motivates the work and the ministry that we do and those who are supporting the Fund for Leaders. So in the interest of talking about sustainability and then wholeness and wellness, the first question I have is, as you reflect on your experiences, what capacity have you built or strengthened in the last year that you think will be helpful to you for your future in ministry? So where has your well been dug more deeply, perhaps, or where have those roots grown deeper? Because these are extraordinary times where we all need a little to dig a little deeper to get the kind of support and capacities that we need to be able to make it through these times and into the future. So let me see what your answers might be to that question.
I'll
Sure,
jump in.
Daniel. Yeah, thanks.
I was thinking about, I know you mentioned specifically about us, what our capacity, you said capacity we have built for ourselves for the long haul. I'm going to answer this a little more like built within our congregation.
Sure, absolutely.
At the moment, this is where I'm called to be, and I see myself here for the long haul until such a time that my gifts aren't, whatever. So one of the things I think we've built during the COVID time, especially, is I call it a proof of concept. And so while a year and a half ago, I may have gone to council and say, look, I think one thing that we could do that would be hugely impactful in our community is to go online with an online presence. And then impactful among ourselves is to think about how can we shape our teams and our committees in a way that we can have an online meeting to save folks commuter time and those kind of pieces. And I think about a year and a half ago, if I had brought those things forward, then we have the team to discuss the ability to do the plan, to think about the feasibility study and all this kind of stuff. But when COVID hit, it's a Friday morning, we say, no, we need to suspend worship. And I say, if you trust me, we'll be online Sunday. And then we are. And now we have this proof of concept that's going to change our life together for a long haul. And so now the same is true for our congregation as a whole, in terms of our teams and our committees, our leadership, a proof of concept that we can have meetings by Zoom and be just as effective and efficient in our communications. And I mention this because it has an impact for me as the leader of the church, because it does cut my commuter time, right? Evening meetings can happen faster in my living room or my office at home, right? And so it cuts my days differently. And so it'll help me in the long run be a more efficient leader and more healthy leader to establish some of those boundaries, because we're able to engage in new, a little more advanced technology ways with each other.
Right. Excellent. Win-win all around. Yep. Alyssa, did your hand go up? Nope. Okay. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, and this kind of goes on what Daniel and Alyssa said earlier too, but I think even that word capacity has really come into my lexicon a lot more in saying I do have the capacity for this or I don't have the capacity for this. Boundaries have needed to play a big part. And for me, it's looked like what's a priority right now, especially at the beginning of the pandemic and kind of just trying to see, we're building the plan as we're flying it. What is a priority and what's not a priority? Because I can't make everything a priority, and some things just are going to have to be deprioritized. And that's been very helpful in communicating with colleagues, with council, even just the congregation, to say, if you need that to be a priority for me, I need to tell you, or I need to figure out what isn't going to be a priority, because I can't do it all. That, of course, you're going to have to fail at that many times before being bold in those boundaries. But it is something I think we are called to do, is to lead with our own capacities that can't just be everything for everyone always. And so I think our congregations are looking at us to say, oh, wow, there is a boundary there that he isn't pushing. And that's something that I can take and apply to my life. Though I needed to learn that from others as well. And I took a lot of inspiration from others. So I've really appreciated understanding what capacity has meant in a new way with COVID, and really what my boundaries are and what can be a priority and what can't.
Great wisdom in that. Raylan or Alyssa, anything you want to add because I'm going to pivot to a slightly different but related kind of subject when it comes to sustainability and capacity. So let me move to that question. Um, so for each of you, or whoever would like to answer, you received Fund for Leaders scholarship support while you were in seminary. What difference did that scholarship make to you, and perhaps to your family, personally? But then also vocationally, professionally, what difference has that made for you now into your ministry, that you're wherever it is that you're serving now? Yeah, Raylan.
I will say that like not having that financial burden during seminary really allowed me to see what gifts I had. So if I did,
Hmm.
so having that, it allowed me to be able to work at a hospital and do chaplaincy work while I was in seminary. So that gave me the ability to see that chaplaincy and pastoral care was one of my gifts that I don't think I necessarily would have explored. So honestly, so not having that really gave me the financial freedom, I would say, to really explore my gifts and to see where my heart lied and where I could best be used and as God's vessel. So that really helped me explore that.
Beautiful. Alyssa, did your hand go up?
No, but I can share. Definitely the same experience. I didn't, especially in seminary, did not have to focus on my finances quite as much, and certainly not as much as some of my classmates. I definitely had classmates who came out of undergrad, with mountains of loans, and they were piling on, and the stress of that, and that's certainly true in congregations as well. Particularly in a pandemic, there's this complete freak out at the start of this, right, about finances. And I do think that the generosity of others in my life has given me the ability to step back and to say, what we know is true, which is that money follows mission, and that we can trust this. We can trust that this will be okay. I've seen the generosity of others. I've been called to be generous. We can ask that, right? We can make that call as well. But to know that I've just been very, very touched by the generosity of others, and so I trust it to know that it'll come through. Um, I don't want that to sound, though, dismissive of people with real economic need. Certainly not the case. But I think that there is a call to generosity there that has been made clearer to me thanks to Fund for Leaders.
Great. And that relates, I'm going to come back to you in a second, Ben, but it relates to a sort of a third level question that's tied up in all of this, which is, which you already hit on, which is uh, having received financial support through the Fund for Leaders, knowing what the difference that has made to you and how it's equipped you or in your leadership in your congregation, but then also in a way to attune you in some ways to those who are facing financial difficulty during this pandemic, as you were just talking about. Understanding, knowing what those pressures are like, having perhaps had to face them in different ways yourself, and then knowing what a difference it means when you're getting something like the Fund for Leaders to make a difference. Ben, I'm sorry.
No, I resonate so deeply with that, and I think back to the Fund for Leader dinner that I had, and I learned there that I was the Portico Fund for Leader scholar, meaning that the community of Portico, the staff and the employees of Portico, made my scholarship happen that year. I think for the first year. And that carried with me throughout seminary, having not only their prayers and support. I would show up at a synod assembly and people would recognize me from an email or a website saying, like, you're our person. And that was incredible to have that community of support, but to also know that a small part of somebody's paycheck was going towards the investment of this church in me it was quite daunting, to be honest, but also an incredible privilege to say somebody is investing in me in a consistent basis. They are holding fundraisers for this to be possible. They are making sure that this church is taken care of through me. So that community support in that specific instance from Portico was just incredible. And it shows up in many ways that that relationship that I have with them continues to support me.
Fantastic. Yes, Daniel.
Yeah, just to kind of keep that train moving. I mean, simply put, I would not have gone to seminary if not for Fund for Leaders Scholarship. And I won't get the whole call story, but Fund for Leaders Scholarship was just one of so many signs that kind of fell upon me, and I count it as a blessing from God and a sign that this was something worth exploring and discerning. And so, entering into seminary, then that experiencing the generosity of that gift, and there are many moments in seminary, and still today, where you wake up and you think, "What am I doing?" Right? I'll name that. But then I also had this moment where I think, you know what? There are so many people, and I'll never know their names fully, who have invested in me in the ministry through which I get to participate, and that becomes just like this cloud of affirmation around me that says, yes, God is stirring here, and that I am called to do this. And there are a host of saints, past and present, who affirm that for me, and that I find just remarkably beautiful. And I think and so I'm realizing more and more that every time I'm surprised by generosity, I also realize that like I no longer have a reason to be surprised by generosity, because it just keeps happening. And I experienced that in this congregation too. And I think the last part of your question is, I'm blessed. I just inherited two folks who are in seminary at my congregation, and it's helped us have very honest conversations about ministry in terms of wholeness and yourself and your family and financial expectations and burdens going forward. And so I'm deeply grateful for a scholarship. My wife too received a Fund for Leader scholarship. And so, we're blessed with good financial management that we can, for the long haul, we're going to be very healthy financially for ourselves and our future. So to those who are here, thank you.
Thank you. And the four of you are making my heart burst in a wonderful way, because what the four of you have talked about is really what the Fund for Leaders is all about. It's to enable those to go to seminary who otherwise perhaps wouldn't have gone to seminary, Daniel. It's to, in a way, help change recipients' relationship with the church and with those that are help making their education possible, Ben, as you were alluding to. And Alyssa, it's a way for us to help equip you to be the good stewardship leaders in your congregations who can trust the generosity and be generous yourselves, but also to lead others into generosity. And Raylan, to help all of you explore your own giftedness, to be free to explore the ways in which God is calling you, is gifting you, and is making you a treasure to the ministry and the church that you feel called to serve. That's what Fund for Leaders is all about. I want to pivot as we bring our conversation now to a close. I'd like to just focus for a couple of minutes on perhaps what we might call some lessons learned for each of you. So as rostered ministers, we all know that our learning does not end when we leave seminary. Learning continues. And so now as you look back over the course of the last year or so, can you think of an example of something that you may have done or led in response to COVID-19 pandemic, or in response to the renewed cries for racial and social justice, or to this polarized context in which we find ourselves, or maybe the uncertain economy, something that you may have done that now, with the benefit of experience, as you look back, you think, maybe I should have done that differently. It's sort of that reflective moment that allows you then to think a little differently about where you go from here. Sure, Alyssa.
Yeah, I said this a little bit earlier, so I won't say a lot, but I would say anytime I look back and think maybe I should have done that differently, it's almost always because I moved too fast.
Mm.
So it's okay to slow down, to take a moment to think through something, to think through the trajectory of it. Like, is this sustainable capacity? Ben talked about that a valid question. But yeah, but to know that I don't have to do too much, that I don't need to put too much on my people, that simple is good and sometimes simple is best. And so that's the over and over I'm reminded. You jumped into that a little bit too quickly. And also that it's okay to back up. Like I've got a lot of
Hmm.
pride. I don't like to admit that I do things bad and wrong. So annoying. It's okay to back up.
Yeah. Excellent. Anybody else?
It's definitely okay to
Yeah.
back up and it's okay to fail. And I keep saying this because I felt a lot of the times that like this book club or this activity or this Zoom activity or whatever the case may be was not necessarily for the needs of this congregation. And that's okay that like it didn't take off. And like sitting with that and then continue. So I've been like very transparent and authentic with my people and saying, guys, I'm gonna fail a lot. I'm gonna mess up, but I'm gonna keep on trying because we are in unprecedented times. So just having like, if you see an idea and you try to figure it out and it doesn't work, that's okay. You can scrap it. That's you. It's okay to scrap these
Right.
ideas around. And like just going back to the ancient text and seeing how people failed there and like taking a lead from the biblical people is very helpful.
Sure. Excellent. Yes, Ben and then Daniel.
Yeah, I probably would have bought Zoom stock earlier, but that's neither here nor there. I really do think for me, especially the last 2 weeks, it's been a tough 2 weeks here on Capitol Hill. There's no denying that. And being able to sort of share and be vulnerable with my context and with my community in that like we're not okay right now and it's not okay if you're not okay. That is a really vulnerable thing to lead from, but the way, and kind of a tricky thing too. You can't go too far, especially as a pastor, especially providing care, all of these things. And sort of that conversation of showing up, especially in DC, and not having it all together at like at any one time, that has opened up some really beautiful conversations in that like we have, I think, been able to grow as a community. Some of these smaller side conversation, coffee hour on Zoom or whatever, have really been able to support each other in new and different ways when we let that veil down. We trust in Christ's love and grace, and we know that God's got us, and we don't have to have it all together at all the time. So we know God will bless the mess, and to lean into that a little bit is just fine. And that is something that I sort of learned the last couple of weeks, certainly, but I think throughout this time apart in distance as well.
Appreciate that. Daniel.
Yeah, I think I affirm all those things, and mine is gonna be a little more vulnerable, I think, here for me, for myself, and leaning back to that kind of wholeness for the long haul piece. That looking back, I'm a very much I've got this kind of guy, and even as things compound themselves, and here at our congregation, we all of this stuff plus we have a 120 kid preschool that closed and now is reopening, and so we went through some turnover and turmoil there. But so all these things kind of built, and I'm very much I've got this, I can do it, I've got this, and I power through. And for myself, looking back differently now that take some steps to better take care of myself, and that's as easy as going to the gym, and as more vulnerable as you know, a spiritual director or a coach or speaking with someone regularly to share the burdens of those things who are not directly connected to the community. And I've named that for myself now, and in those relationships that are helpful. But I think differently going back, at some point there was enough signs that I needed support outside my congregation that I should have sought. Yeah.
Good for you. Good for all of you. Look, I just want to, we're going to draw to a close now. I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you, Alyssa. Thank you, Raylan. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for being the excellent ministers that you are. Thank you for the excellent ministry that you're doing. Faithful servant leaders, one and all. Thank you for engaging in this conversation with us today. For all of you making yourselves a little bit vulnerable. But trusting that the people who are watching are people who care about you and want to invest in you. So I want to thank everybody who's watching right now, who will be watching the recorded event. Thank you for taking time to be here, for caring about these people, for caring about the Fund for Leaders and the other leaders like these four that we are able to support now and into the future. We can only do that with your help. We will follow up with you in the days ahead. You're all going to receive an email from us in the next couple of days thanking you. There's going to be a link to the recording of this event in case you'd like to see it again, or maybe even share it with others in a group setting in your congregation, others that you think might benefit from listening into this conversation. And then sometime in the coming days and weeks ahead, you're either going to hear from me directly, or you're going to hear from one of my mission funding director colleagues or regional gift planner colleagues who will follow up with you, get your feedback, and see if, in light of everything that you've experienced and heard today and knowing more about the Fund for Leaders, whether or not you might be interested in renewing or perhaps even growing your financial support of the Fund for Leaders. So please take the phone call when it's made, or the Zoom visit when it is offered. We value you, and we value our relationship with you and your relationship with this ministry. Finally, gifts to the Fund for Leaders can be made at any time. Go to elca.org/fundforleaders/donate. It's an easy way to give online. I just want to one more time say thank you to our panelists. Thank all of you for being here. Go in peace, serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.